Fedora tippers are infamous for trying and pitifully failing to convince women that they should give a nice guy a chance, often with terrifying or cringy results. But I've discovered a rogue mutation, my friends. This nicest of guys pretends to be a cheap knockoff feminist while leaning into every sexist trope imaginable, with laughably bad results. But first, sponsor time. Do you like companions, familiars, and all sorts of furry TRPG friends? Well, if you really want to get into the intricacies and fun of proper pet ownership, you will find the rules as written leaving a lot to be desired. That's where Battlezoo Eldamon comes in handy. Battlezoo Eldamon allows you to befriend, train, and battle over 150 new creatures. I mean, look at this little guy. While any class can collect and train Eldamon, there are two classes dedicated to it. The Eldamon trainer can evolve them, phase them across planes, and with over 150 Eldamon and 20 elements, the trainer has a diverse range of playstyles. The avatar can master the elemental power of the Eldamon themselves, choosing one of 20 elemental powers via their Eldamon companion. The project is now live on Kickstarter, so what are you waiting for? Check it out, linked below. An old story, but one I've been thinking about a lot recently. Okay, so this was a one-shot at a convention a friend of mine was running as his first foray into DMing. It looked like a module, but I don't know the name. Basically, a load of goblins had been stealing from travelers and were taking it back to a cave network, where it turned out they were giving it to a dragon for its hoard. The game had 4 set characters. Normally I would play the cleric or the barbarian, but as I was the most experienced and had been GMing for a long time, I said I would just take what was left to fill out the party and help the new GM or new players if there were any problems or they needed advice. By rule of ladies first, and my sister-in-law and the other girl, whose name I don't remember, not knowing what to do meant my wife picks first, and she decided to play the dwarf barbarian to try something different than rogue or bard. My sister-in-law and the girl had been talking and asked if they could both play the half-elf rogue so that they could confer on what to do as they hadn't played before. The DM says that's okay, and my wife offers to help them as rogue was her main class. Then, nice guy goes next, as I had been okay with. And I had been telling him earlier that I main cleric and it's a fairly back of party and responsible role. He picks elf cleric. Fair enough, that leaves me with the human fighter. Now, before I get into the session, I should mention that there had been other red flags with nice guy, so I will list a few of the big ones. 1. He repeatedly talked over any woman he was nearby while proclaiming how much of a feminist he was. These guys never fail to crack me up. They somehow find a way to wedge themselves into any women's conversation just to show that they're one of the good men who they should totally date, am I right? Desperation comes in many forms, but this is one of the unintentionally funniest. Watching his man bun bob as he predatorily hoverboards towards the nearest protest. Roe v. Wade, more like no v. way anyone knows more about women's oppression than this guy right here. So sit down, females. The knight in shining armor is talking. He also spent almost 10 minutes arguing why he should have won a round of Cards Against Humanity because his was, quote, smarter, and he wouldn't accept that my sister-in-law was funnier as a reason. He also explained to my Irish friend how stupid the troubles in Ireland were when my friend's family were on both sides and lost family during the troubles. He was then telling us that marriage and monogamy is an outdated and sexist concept of the monogamous patriarchy. My wife was my fiancé at the time. Ew, loving stable relationship with your one and only? Cringe! I'm sorry, but if you've found your one and only, you're actually a victim of the cisgender heteropatriarchy of Caucasian religious colonizers who have, of course, invented monogamy to control people. Why? We still don't really know to this day. But what we do know, that somewhere out there is a nice guy, tipping his fedora to the wind, ready to liberate all of these so-called happy and content brides-to-be from their patriarchal oppressors, provided they exclusively date him instead, of course. But trust me, he gets so much worse. He then tells my wife how much she reminds him of Fluttershy from My Little Pony, who appears to have severe social anxiety. My wife has severe clinical anxiety and has been in therapy for years to get better, so being compared to this character did not help. And we found out he has a huge crush on that character and even has porn of that character on his phone. He told me that my wife was good how she was and that I should stop trying to turn her into something that she isn't. Note, the something she isn't is confident, likes being around people, and handles her anxiety. The how she was quiet, scared, meek, and had panic attacks around the clock just from being near her friends and family. Never mind a convention of almost 3,000 people. Is this serious? Not only is he the worst person you've ever heard of, he's also fetishizing a woman to her face as Fluttershy from My Little Pony. Woo, you have social anxiety? Small bean, you're just like this children's TV pony that I happen to have a misshapen man boner for.
Bleh.
It's just a damn shame the patriarchy is oppressing you into thinking you love your husband. Sad emoji times 6. Only real ones get it. Lastly, he rejected alcoholic drinks that were brought for the table we were at because alcohol weakens the mind. Oh, trust me, I don't think it's the alcohol you should be worried about. Man is a Twitter account personified. I would normally call it at being a troll post here, but honestly, I've met people like this and we just gotta see his behavior play out and judge from there. So without further ado, roll post. There are a lot more, and this guy had been in our group for years, and we just couldn't get rid of him, partly because most of us wouldn't tell him to sod off because they were shy, and the 3 of us that would didn't like to because he had a ton of issues, and we just felt sorry for the guy. And other members, including my wife, the GM of this game, and many others would always make excuses that he didn't understand, or he's just a little awkward, or he's harmless. Looking back, I now realize that's how so many people like him get away with some really toxic behavior. And I don't put up with this kind of behavior anymore, even if I wind up looking like the bad guy. Back to campaign. As soon as the game starts, Nice Guy, who is playing the cleric, decides to take every opportunity to get in the way of my wife, who is playing a dwarf barbarian wielding a +1 great axe, +3 against goblins. He has a sling and a scimitar and decides that, as a man of God, he must be on the front line protecting Milady. Note that the dwarf barbarian my wife is playing is male. I tried to gently explain to him that was a bad idea. He was a purely healing and buffing cleric, no damaging spells, studded leather armor, and that he wasn't working with the party, and continually dragged out every fight for way longer than it should have been by getting in the way and trying to take hits for my wife's character. And occasionally the 2 girls rogue, though not as often. He ignored everything, even when I suggested fighting from the back line with the rogue, who, by the way, were playing amazingly. Between the 2 of them, they came up with really creative solutions. They pinged enemies from the back line and got the hang of backstabbing really quickly, as me and my wife were the front line and we did need range support. He continued to physically get in the way to defend the barbarian dwarf and try and attack high-level enemies. Truly a white knight. The table is getting angrier. The DM is losing control and getting disheartened, and my wife is furious with him to the point where this normally very shy and quiet woman starts almost screaming at him to get to the back or she will chop his head off and will go on without him. Nobody but him and me argued with that idea, but it continued. until he became so much of a problem that we only had the table for about 30 minutes left and we weren't even halfway through the dungeon. Finally, I passed a note to the DM. I tie up the cleric and carry him. He made me make a roll for both, and there I was. I had to abandon my bow and hand out some of my potions, but that was fine. The rogue girls were ecstatic to get a bow rather than throwing knives. We carry on, occasionally swapping between my fighter and my wife's barbarian. Looking back, he tried to make escape checks a lot less often when my wife's character was carrying him, which has just skeeved us both out at the thought. We meet the boss of the dungeon, a goblin chief riding a spider. Perfect. I dump the cleric and tell him to stay there out of trouble. The fight begins, and that guy is constantly trying to escape, until he does. He charges past the rogue on 2 HP, runs past me dealing with 3 goblins and on half HP, and puts himself directly between my wife's barbarian, who was at full HP, and the goblin chief she had been preparing a big attack for. An attack that would deal 3d8 plus 10 damage to his goblin chief. Nice Guy took the damage from the goblin chief, 1d6 with a d6 poison damage, and it nearly floored him. This attack would have barely scratched my wife's barbarian because, of course it wouldn't. She was a barbarian and a dwarf, and had advantage against goblins and poison. After I finally lose my temper with him, and my wife having to move her character model and charge the attack a further 2 rounds, the fight was done, and we won, and I ordered him to heal the rogue while my wife and I take health potions. He still tries to heal my wife's barbarian, who had taken a total of 2 points of damage, which was completely his fault for getting in the way and dragging out the fight and forcing her to suffer an attack of opportunity. But she has her dwarf physically slap him and in-character scream at him, and he does as she says. Even me and the DM were done with this guy's shit at this point, and we had 10 minutes left. We cleared over half of the dungeon in 20 minutes when he was tied up, when before that it had taken us almost an hour and a half to get to the halfway point just because of him slowing us down. This is when the DM shows us what was meant to be the epic dragon fight at the end of the dungeon. The dragon flies away to speed things up, which pisses all of us off. This results in one of my first time in-character PvPs, and the rogue, using a bag of goblin heads they had gotten off of my wife during one of our trades off carrying the cleric, she had been collecting the heads in a burlap sack for serial killer reasons. The rogue joins in as we lay into the cleric until he is dead and bleeding, while the barbarians stole all of the loot. We would take his money, and then we would claim that the goblins killed the cleric, while we curse his name to oblivion. He complained to anyone that would listen, but by that point I took everyone away and ran a game of Maid RPG to calm down, and I refused to let him join. Just before we get to the climax of the story, I want to add that anyone who knows me knows that I hate the idea of solving out-of-game problems in the game. However, in this specific scenario, OP mentioned the rest of the group enabling his behavior, presumably because they were too agreeable. So honestly, with that in mind, short of staging a walkout and causing buckets of drama and potentially losing good, though timid friends, anyone who is so quick to belittle something as terrible and recent as the Troubles, as well as being the most annoying fake progressive anybody ever knew, not even counting the pony debacle, is pretty much beneath my sympathies. So, again, honestly, this seems like a valid way to establish that Nice Guy is no longer welcome within the confines of an easily excusable RP setting, while also not being too terribly personal or dramatic. This wasn't my favorite method, but did it get the job done? Let's find out. I felt bad, and would later apologize to DM for how things went down, but he told me he was happy, because that guy apparently had done the same thing the day before and learned nothing. and he would proceed to get in the way of combat to save the lovely lady he was crushing on, even if she was playing a dwarf barbarian or dragonborn paladin, until he was finally told he was banned from joining in any of the one-shots being run at the convention due to dragging the games out and making sessions late or not finished due to time constraints. I would later lose contact with that guy, and I don't regret it one bit, after he sent a plush of that same My Little Pony character he fetishized, and told my wife she was like Fluttershy under the guise of a birthday present. Her birthday was in August, and he sent it in June. A commenter summed it up best. "Don't let the patriarchy change you. I like you just the way you are. Unconfident, unassertive, and needing emotional support from me. Now, let me impress you with my feats of strength against these imaginary goblins." It's short of a pony fetish and incessant nice-guying, but this fedora-tipping fighter had more issues than an encyclopedia. Look, this story was so bad, I'm ready to break out a rare story from one of my own campaigns just to lighten the mood and hopefully remind myself of why I play these games in the first place. But fair warning, if you do stick around, it's pretty dumb. So allow me to set the stage. This was one of my longest campaigns ever. I'm talking years of play in my own homebrewed game system set in my own sci-fi setting. Years of love and work was put into the development and play of this campaign, leading our party through the stars on a quest to stop an ancient space creature prophesized to devour the stars and bring on the end of all things. The only people who could stop it? A chaotic duo consisting of a space dwarf and a mad scientist. Now, despite being the only people who could save the universe, they were wanted fugitives with large bounties on their heads. The dwarf was wanted dead for unending and delusional conspiracy theories against the crown, as well as insulting the Empress, distastefully calling her a whale, and the scientist was wanted for near every other crime under the suns, from torture to tax evasion. They ventured across the stars for 2 real-life years, at least twice a week, evading the law, solving problems, and slowly unraveling the mystery of the ancient evil, as well as how to suppress it. After those 2 years, I decided that enough was enough and it was time to kick the campaign into the final stretch, by finally unveiling their true enemy. After doing some work in exchange for information, the party learns that this creature they're hunting was defeated by the Empire once long ago, and the only known records would be in the Empire's most guarded library. The creature was by far the most complex villain I had ever conceived. A Cthulhu-like eternal being that was shifting and contorting the constellations to spread its tentacled reach, eventually causing the universe to collapse in on itself if left unchecked. But the party didn't know that just yet. They had infinite options and ways to get into the library. But Plix the dwarf, conspiracy theorist wanted dead for directly insulting the crown, had convinced the rest of the party that a face-to-face discussion about the gravity of the situation with the Empress herself was the only fitting way to unite the known universe against this threat. Oh, interesting. You see, they were on a kill-on-sight basis, so their plan was to sneak into the throne room, try to convince her to see past their antagonistic history, let the party into the library, and then fight against whatever lurks out in space, hoping that they could simply dig up the articles in the library as proof of their intentions if they must. Honestly, as a DM, I thought it was really dumb. But they have had worse plans, and I was just relieved that they had one instance where murder wasn't the first and last solution, so I humored them. Big mistake. The party arrives in the throne room through one of the vents, and upon being noticed for who they are, the Empress laughs. "We've been searching for you for years, and you simply turn yourselves over? We knew you were mad, but this hinges on absolute insanity. Before you meet your makers, I must know, did you gain a conscience? Or do you understand how futile your efforts are, doomed ones? The dwarf Plix responded, "The only exercise in futility is you running from the truth. You really thought you could hide underneath a crown and a banner." I was intrigued. The rest of the party, myself included, were thoroughly captivated by what he had to say. "But I know who you really are, your highness. Or should I say, your whaliness." Everyone at the table at this point lets out a collective exasperated sigh as it dawns on all of us that he has doomed the rest of the party for a conspiracy theorist gag. "I draw my harpoon cannon, take aim and fire." Lo and behold, he hits. At this point, as a DM and the rest of the party are panicking. They are in a throne room surrounded by guards in an Imperial flagship with no reasonable way to escape. The chances of the party's survival are minuscule, as it's 2 against the Empress's personal security detail, as well as an entire capital ship full of troopers. The party's been in deep before, but not this deep. Never this deep. That's when I had to fight chaos with chaos. You fire your harpoon into the small, frail old woman, pinning her to her throne. She bleeds a black ooze from her chest. Her skin turns to a dark blue, slowly bulging and inflating. Her mouth rolling to the back of her head, forming an orifice where her crown once sat. Rapidly then, she consumes the space of 100 men. She begins to grow too large and too blue for her own throne room, thrashing about, breaking down walls and smearing her former guard detail into a fine red paste. An alarm sounds. What do? Everybody's jaws are on the floor, eyes wide in shock and horror. None of this makes sense. Plix the dwarf had many conspiracies, but none of them ever contained even a shadow of truth. It couldn't be. He believed moons were made of cheese, dry erase boards were magic, the universe was 200 years old, and that the Empress was secretly a whale. The party used the commotion to exfiltrate back to their ship and live to see another day, watching as the whale gained power, consuming the remains of the Empire's flagship. I ended the session there. The finale was 8 straight hours of rallying the universe's forces to hunt and eventually destroy the space whale. The campaign ended there, though much sooner than expected. To this day, my players still have no idea if that was ever my plan or intention. So if any of you are watching right now, especially Plix the dwarf, you all are scoundrels and you disgust me. Also, D&D is next Saturday, and if you can buy the pizza this time, I'd appreciate that. You still owe me $10. Anyways, if you want to hear more D&D stories, good and bad, click the funny boxes to my side here. Till next time.